It's up to you, Charlie, my boy, said Mr. Wonka. It's your factory. Shall we let your Grandma Georgina wait it out for the next 2 years, or shall we try to bring her back right now? Real quick, I best I gotta go over this. Grandma Georgina took so many that if you take each pill does 20 years. Okay? So each of the three, Grandma Georgina, Grandpa Joe, and Grandma Josephine, all took 4 pills because they got greedy and they all took 4 pills.
And now they're babies.
Now they're babies, except for Grandma Georgina. She was 78. So when she took 4 pills each pill is worth 20 years. That takes you back. So now she has to wait 2 years before she comes back into existence.
Can I read?
Huh?
Can I read?
What do you want to read? Yeah.
Where are we at?
Right there.
It's up to you, Charlie, my boy, said Mr. Wonka. It's your factory. Shall we let your Grandma Georgina wait it out for the next 2 years, or shall we try to bring her back right now? You don't really mean you might be able to bring her back, cried Charlie. There's no harm in trying. Is there? If that's the way you want it. Oh yes, of course I do. For mother's sake,
especially,
can't you see how sad she is? How sad she is?
Want me to take over?
She is? Yeah.
Okay. Mrs. Bucket was sitting on the edge of the big bed, dabbling her eyes with a hanky. My poor old mother, she kept saying. She's -2, and I won't see her again for months and months and months, if ever at all. Behind her, Grandpa Joe, with the help of Oompa Loompa, was feeding his 3-month-old wife, Grandma Josephine, from a bottle. Alongside them, Mr. Bucket was spooning something called Wonka's Spudge Melon baby food into 1-year-old Grandpa George's mouth, but mostly all over his chin and chest. Big deal, he was muttering angrily. What a lousy, rotten, busted up this is. They tell me I'm going to the chocolate factory to have a good time, and I finish up being a mother to my father-in-law. Everything's under control, Charlie, said Mr. Wonka, surveying the scene. They're doing fine. They don't need us here. Come along. We're off to hunt for Grandma. He caught Charlie by the arm and went dancing toward the open door of the great glass elevator. Hurry up, my dear boy. Hurry up, he cried. We've got to hustle if we're going to get there before. Before what, Mr. Wonka? Before she gets subtracted, of course. All minuses are subtracted. Don't you know any arithmetic at all? They were in the elevator now, Mr. Wonka was. So remember how the Great Goose, when the, what's-her-face went on the goose and fell in? And they were hoping that they did not light the furnace, that particular furnace? Or when Ivanka turned into a blueberry and they had to go, squeeze her to get the blueberry out? Or they had to go stretch the one kid? This is what they're doing now. They gotta get before she gets minus, so they gotta go to the minus room. Scratching among the heads of the buttons for one he wanted. Here we are, he said, placing his finger delicately upon a tiny ivory button on which it said, Minus Land. The door slid shut, and then with a fearful whistle, whirring sound, the great machine leaped away to the right. Charlie grabbed Mr. Wonka's leg and held it on tight. Mr. Wonka pulled a jump seat out of the wall and said, Sit down, Charlie, quick, and strap yourself in tight. This journey is going to be rough, choppy. There were straps on either side of the seat, and Charlie buckled himself firmly in. Mr. Wonka pulled out a second seat for himself and did the same. So now they're all back in the great glass elevator again, but just this time it's Grandpa Joe, Charlie, and Mr. Wonka. And they're going to Minus Land. Now, just exactly how it sounds. In math, there's a minus, so this is Minus Land. We're going a long way down, he said. Oh, such a long way down we are going. The elevator was gathering speed. It twisted and swerved. It swung sharply to the left, then went to the right, then left again. It was heading downward all the time. Down and down and down. I only hope, said Mr. Wonka, the Oompa Loompas aren't using the other elevator today. What other elevator? Asked Charlie. The one that goes the opposite way of the same track as this. Holy snakes, Mr. Wonka. You mean we might have a collision? I've always been lucky so far, my boy. Hey, take a look out there, quick. Through the window, Charlie caught a glimpse of what seemed like an enormous quarry with a steep, crag-brown rock face. And all over the rock face, there were hundreds of Oompa Loompas working with picks and pneumatic drills. Rock candy, said Mr. Wonka. That's the richest deposit of rock candy in the world. So you guys all heard of rock candy, right? It's on a stick. Now they're actually on a mountain and a quarry. You know how like rock quarries? Now they're actually on a quarry that's digging out rock candy. So remember, this is Oompa Loompa land. You know, this is they're in the factory and they have mountains of rock candy. Rock candy, said Mr. Wonka, that's the richest pot of rock candy in the world. The elevator sped up. We're going deeper, Charlie, deeper and deeper. We're about 200,000 feet down already. Strange sightings were flashing by outside, but the elevator was traveling at such terrific speed that only occasionally was Charlie able to recognize anything at all. Once he thought he saw in the distance a cluster of tiny houses shaped like upside-down cups, and there were streets in between the houses, and Oompa Loompas walking in the streets. Another time, as they were passing some sort of vast red plain dotted with things that looked like oil derricks, he saw a great spout of brown liquid spurting out of the ground high into the air. A gusher, cried Mr. Wonka, clapping at him. A whacking great gusher. How splendid! Just when we needed it. A what? Said Charlie. We've struck chocolate again, my boy. That'll be a rich new field. So instead of oil, they're striking chocolate fields. So instead of oil gushing up, it's chocolate gushing up. So they're drilling for chocolate.
Like Wonka chocolate.
That'll be a rich new field. Oh, what a beautiful gusher. Just look at it go. On they roared, heading down more steeply than ever now, and literally hundreds of astonishing sights kept flashing by outside. There were giant cogwheels turning the mixing in bubbles, bubbling, and vast orchards of toffee apple trees, and lakes the size of football fields filled with blue and gold and green liquid. And everywhere there were Oompa Loompas. You realize, said Mr. Wonka, that what you saw earlier on what you went around the factory with all those naughty little children was only a tiny corner of the establishment. It goes down for miles and miles. And as soon as possible, I shall show you all the way around slowly and properly. But that will take 3 weeks. Right now, we have other things to think about. And I have important things to tell you. Listen carefully to me, Charlie. I must talk fast, for we'll be there in a couple minutes. I suppose you guessed, Mr. Wonka went on, what happened to all those Oompa Loompas in the testing room when I was experimenting with Wonkafite. Of course you did. They disappeared and became minuses, just like your grandma Georgina. The recipe was miles too strong. One of them actually became minus 87. Imagine that. You mean he's got to wait 87 years before he can come back, Charlie said? That's what kept bugging me, my boy. After all, one can't allow one's best friends to wait around as miserable minuses for 87 years. And get subtracted as well, said Charlie. That would be frightful. Of course it would, Charlie. So what did I do, Willy Wonka? I said to myself, if you can invent Wonkavite to make people younger, then surely to goodness you can also invent something else to make people older. Aha, cried Charlie. I see what you're getting at. Then you could turn the minuses quickly back into pluses and bring them home again. Precisely, my dear boy. Precisely. Always supposing, of course, that I could find out where the minuses had gone to. The elevator plunged on, diving steeply toward the center of the earth. All was blackness outside now. There was nothing to see. So once again, Mr. Wonka went on. I rolled up my sleeves and set to work. Once again, I squeezed my brain, searching for the new recipe. I had to create age, to make people old, older, oldest. Ha ha, I cried, for now the ideas were beginning to come. What is the oldest living thing in the world? What lives longer than anything else? A tree, said Charlie. Right you are, Charlie. What kind of tree? Not that Douglas fir, not the giant redwood, not the sequoia. No, no, my boy. It's a tree called the bristlecone pine that grows upon the slopes of Wheeler Park in Nevada, USA. You can find bristlecone pines on Wheeler Peak today that are over 4,000 years old. This is a fact, Charlie. Ask one dendrologist you like and look that word up in the dictionary when you get home. Will you please? So, that started me off. I jumped into the great glass elevator and rushed all over the world collecting special items from the oldest living things. A pint of a sap from a 4,000-year-old bristlecone pine. The toenail clippings from a 168-year-old Russian farmer called Petrovich Gregorgovich. An egg laid by a 200-year-old tortoise belonging to the king of Tonga. the tail of a 51-year-old horse in Arabia, the whiskers of a 36-year-old cat called Crumpets, an old flea which had lived on crumpets for 36 years, the tail of a 207-year-old giant rat from Tibet, the back teeth of a 90-year-old gremlin king living in a cave on Mountain Popocatépetl, the knuckle bones of a 7-year-old Catalu from Peru. All over the world, Charlie, I tracked down very old, ancient animals and took an important little bit of something from each one of them. A hair or an eyebrow or something. It was no more than an ounce or two of toe jam scrapes from between its toes while it was sleeping. I tracked down the whistle pig, the bobolink, the skyrock, the polyfrog, the giant grulik, the stinging slough.
Did Mr. Wonka collect these?
Yep, he was collecting all these from all over the world. The venomous squircle who can spit poison right into your eye from 50 yards away. But there's no time to tell you about them all now, Charlie. Let me just say quickly that in the end, after lots of boiling and bubbling and mixing and testing in the inventing room, I produced one tiny cup of oily black liquid and gave 4 drops of it to the brave 20-year-old Oompa Loompa volunteer to see what happened. What did happen? Charlie asked. It was fantastic, cried Mr. Wonka. The moment he swallowed, he began wrinkling and shriveling up all over. His hair started dropping off and his teeth started falling out. And before I knew it, he had suddenly become an old fellow of 75. And thus, my dear Charlie, was Vita Vonk invented. Did you rescue all the Oompa Loompa minuses, Mr. Wonka? Every single one of them, my boy. 131 all told. Mind you, it wasn't quite as easy as all that. There were lots of snags and complications along the way. Good heavens, we're nearly there. I must stop talking now and watch where we're going. Charlie realized the elevator was no longer rushing and roaring. It was hardly moving at all now. It seemed to be drifting. Undo your straps, Mr. Wonka said. We must get ready for action. Charlie undid his straps and stood up and peered out. It was an eerie sight. They were drifting in a heavy gray mist, and the mist was swirling and swishing around them as though driven by winds from many sides in the distance. The mist was darker and almost black, and it seemed to be swirling more fiercely than ever over there. Mr. Wonka slid open the doors. Stand back, he said. Don't fall out, Charlie, whatever you do. The mist came into the elevator. It had the fusty, reeky smell of an old underground dungeon. The silence was overpowering. There was no sound at all, no whisper of wind, no voice of creature or insect, and it gave Charlie a queer, frightening feeling to be standing there in the middle of this great, inhuman nothingness, as though he were in another world altogether, in some place where man should never be. Minus Land, whispered Wonka. This is Charlie. This is it, Charlie. The problem now is to find her. We may be lucky, and then again we may not. Chapter 17. Rescue in Minus Land. I don't like it here at all, Charlie whispered. It gives me the willies. Me too, Mr. Wonka whispered back. But we've got a job to do, Charlie, and we must go through with it. The mist was condensing now on the glass walls of the elevator, making it difficult to see out except through the open doors. Do any other creatures live here, Mr. Wonka? Plenty of newlies. Are they dangerous? If they bite you, they are. You're a goner, my boy, if you're bitten by a newlie. The elevator drifted on, rocking gently from side to side. The gray-black, oily fog swirled around them. What does a newlie look like, Mr. Wonka? They don't look like anything, Charlie. They can't. You mean you've never seen one? You can't see newlies, my boy. You can't even feel them until they puncture your skin. That's it, too late. You've got it. They've gotten you. You mean there might be swarms of them all around this very moment, Charlie asked. There might be, said Mr. Wonka. Charlie felt his skin beginning to creep. Do you die at once, he asked. First you become subtracted. A little later you are divided. But very slowly, it takes a little longer. It's long division and it's very painful. After that, you become one of them. Couldn't we shut the door, Charlie asked. I'm afraid not, my boy. We'd never see her through the glass. There's too much mist and moisture. She's not going to be very easy to pick out anyway. Charlie stood at the open door of the elevator and stared into the swirling vapors. This, he thought, is what hell must be like. Hell without heat. There was something unholy about it, something unbelievably diabolical. It was all so deathly quiet, so desolated and empty. At the same time, the constant movement, the twisting and swirling of the misty vapors gave one the feeling that some very powerful force, evil and malignant, was at work. All around, Charlie felt a jab on his arm. He jumped. He almost jumped out of the elevator. Sorry, said Mr. Wonka, it's only me. Oh, Charlie Graff, for a second I thought... I know what you thought, Charlie. And by the way, I'm awfully glad you're with me. How would you like to come here alone, as I did? As I had to many times. I wouldn't, said Charlie. There she is, said Mr. Wonka, pointing. No, she isn't. Oh dear, I could have sworn I saw her for a moment, right over there on the edge of the dark patch. Keep watching, Charlie. There, said Charlie. Over there, look! Where, said Mr. Wonka, pointing to Charlie. She's gone again. She sort of faded away, Charlie said. They stood at the open door of the elevator, peering into the swirly gray vapors. There, quick, right there, Charlie cried. Can't you see her? Yes, Charlie, I see her. I'm moving up close now. Mr. Wonka reached behind him and began touching a number of buttons. Grandma, Charlie cried out. We're come to get you, Grandma. They could see her faintly through the mist. But, oh, so faintly. They could see the mist through her as well. She was transparent. She was hardly there at all. She was just more than a shadow. They could see her face and just the faintest outline of her body, swathered in a nightgown. But she wasn't upright. She was floating lengthwise in the swirling vapor. Why is she lying down? Charlie whispered. Because she's a minus, Charlie. Surely you know what a minus sign looks like. Like what? Mr. Wonka drew a horizontal line in the air with his finger. The elevator glided close. The ghostly shadow of Grandma Georgina's face was no more than a yard away now. Charlie reached out through the door to touch her, but there was nothing there to touch. His hand went right through her skin. Grandma, he grasped. She began to drift away. Stand back, ordered Mr. Wonka, and suddenly from some secret place inside his coattails, he whisked out a spray gun. It was one of those old-fashioned things people used for spraying fly spray around the room before aerosol cans came along. He aimed the spray gun straight at the shadow of Grandma Georgina and pumped the hand hard once, twice, 3 times. Each time a fine black spray spurted out from the nozzle of the gun. Instantly, Grandma Georgina disappeared. A bullseye, cried Mr. Wonka, jumping up and down with excitement. I got her with both barrels. I plussed her good and proper. That's Vitavonk for you. Where's she gone? Charlie asked. Back where she came from, of course. To the factory. She's a minus no longer, my boy. She's a 100% red-blooded plus. Come along now. Let's get out of here quickly before the newlies find us. Mr. Wonka jabbed the button. The doors closed and the great glass elevator shot upward for home. Sit down, strap yourself in again, Charlie, said Mr. Wonka. We're going to flat out this time. The elevator roared and rocketed up toward the surface of the earth. Mr. Wonka and Charlie sat side by side on their little jump seats strapped in tight. Mr. Wonka started tucking the spray gun back into his enormous pocket, somewhere in his coattails. It's such a pity one has to use a clumsy old thing like this, he said, but there's simply no other way of doing it. Ideally, of course, one would measure out exactly the right number of drops into a teaspoon and feed it carefully into the mouth. But it's impossible to feed anything into a minus. It's like trying to feed one's own shadow. That's why I've got to use the spray gun. Spray 'em all over, my boy. That's the only way. It worked fine, though, didn't it? Charlie said. Oh, it worked all right, Charlie. It worked beautifully. All I'm saying is there's bound to be a slight overdose. I don't quite know what you mean, Mr. Wonka. My dear boy, if it only takes 4 drops of Wonkavite to turn a young Oompa Loompa into an old man, Mr. Wonka lifted his hands and let them fall limply onto his lap. You mean Grandma may have gotten too much? Asked Charlie, turning slightly pale. I'm afraid that's putting it rather mildly, said Mr. Wonka. But why did you give her such a lot then? Said Charlie, getting more and more worried. Why did you spray her 3 times? She must have gotten pints and pints of it. Gallons, cried Mr. Wonka, slapping his thighs. Gallons and gallons. But don't let little things like that bother you, my dear Charlie. The important part of it is we've got her back. She's a minus no longer. She's lovely plus. She's a plussy and plussy can be. She's more plussy than you or than me. The question is just how old is she now? Is she more than 103? Chapter 18. The oldest person in the world.
1 second, don't start yet.
Are you ready?
No.
We return in triumph, Charlie, cried Mr. Wonka as the great glass elevator began to slow down. Once more, your dear family will all be together again. The elevator stopped, the door slid open, and there was the chocolate room and the chocolate river and the Oompa Loompas in the middle of all the great bed belonging to the old grandparents. Charlie, said Grandpa Joe, rushing forward. Thank heavens you're back. Charlie hugged him. Then he hugged his mother and his father. Is she here? He said, Grandma Georgina. Nobody answered. Nobody did anything except Grandpa Joe, who pointed to the bed. He pointed, but he didn't look where he was pointing. None of them looked at the bed except Charlie. He walked past them all to get a better view, and he saw at one end the two babies, Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George, both tucked in and sleeping peacefully. At the other end, don't be alarmed, said Mr. Wonka, running up and placing a hand on Charlie's arm. She's bound to be just a tiny bit overplussed. I warned you about that. What have you done to her? Cried Mrs. Bucket. My poor old mother. Proper against the pillows at the other end of the bed was the most extraordinary thing Charlie had ever seen. Was in some ancient fossil? It couldn't be that because it was moving slightly and now it was making sounds, croaking sounds, the kind of sounds a very old frog might make if it knew a few words. Well, 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 it croaked. If it isn't, dear Charlie. Grandma, cried Charlie. Grandma Georgina, oh. Her tiny face was like a pickled walnut. There were such masses of creases and wrinkles that the mouth and eyes and even the nose were sunken almost out of sight. Her hair was pure white and her hands, which were resting on top of the blanket, were just little lumps of wrinkly skin. The presence of this ancient creature seemed to have terrified not only Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, but Grandpa Joe as well. They stood well back away from the bed. Mr. Wonka, on the other hand, was happy as ever. My dear lady, he cried, advancing to the edge of the bed and clasping one of those tiny wrinkled hands in both hands. Welcome home! And how are you feeling on this bright and glorious day? Not too bad, croaked Grandma Georgina. Not too bad at all, considering my age. Good for you, said Mr. Wonka. Atta girl! All we've got to do now is find out exactly how old you are. Then we shall be able to take further action. You're taking no further action around here, said Mrs. Bucket, tight-lipped. You've done enough damage already. But my dear old metal-headed muggle-wump, said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket. What does it matter that the old girl has become a trifle too old? We can put that right in a jiffy. Have you forgotten about the Wonkavite? And however every tablet makes you 20 years younger, we shall bring her back. We shall transform her into a blossoming, blushing maiden in a twink of an eye. What good is that when her husband's not even out of diapers yet? Wailed Mrs. Bucket, pointing fingers at the 1-year-old Grandpa George so peacefully sleeping. Madame, said Mr. Wonka, let us do one thing at a time. I forbid you to give her that beastly Wonkavite, said Mrs. Bucket. You'll turn her into a minus again, and just as sure as I'm standing here. I don't want to be a minus, croaked Grandma Georgina. If I ever have to go back to that beastly minus land again, the Newlies will griddle me. Fear not, said Mr. Wonka. This time I myself will supervise the giving and the medicine. I shall personally see to it that you get the correct dosage. But listen very carefully now. I cannot work out how many pills to give you until I know exactly how old you are. That's obvious, isn't it? It is not obvious at all, said Mrs. Bucket. Why can't you give her one pill at a time and play it safe? Impossible, madame. It is a very serious case such as this. Wonkavite doesn't work at all when given in small doses. You've got to throw everything at her in one go. You've got to hit her with it hard. A single pill wouldn't even begin to shift her. She's too far gone for now. It's all or nothing. No, said Mrs. Bucket firmly. Yes, said Mr. Wonka. Dear lady, please listen to me. If you have a very severe headache and you need 3 aspirin to cure it, it's no good taking only one at a time and waiting for hours between each. You'll never cure yourself that way. You've got to gulp them down all in one go. It's the same with Wonkavite. May I proceed? Oh, all right. I suppose you'll have to, said Mrs. Bucket. Good, said Mr. Wonka, giving a little jump and twirling his feet in the air. Now then, how old are you, my dear Grandma Georgina? I don't know, she croaked. I lost count of that years and years ago. Don't you have any idea, said Mr. Wonka. Of course I don't, gibbered the old woman. Nor would you if you were as old as I am. Think, said Mr. Wonka. You've got to think. The tiny old wrinkled brown walnut face wrinkled itself up more than ever. The others stood waiting. The Oompa Loompas, enthralled by the sight of this ancient object, were all edging closer and closer to the bed. The two babies slept on. Are you, for example, 100, said Mr. Wonka, or 110, or 120? It's no good, she croaked. I never did have a head for numbers. This is catastrophe, cried Mr. Wonka. If you can't tell me how old you are, I can't help you. I dare not risk an overdose. Gloom settled upon the entire company, including, for once, Mr. Wonka himself. You've messed it up good and proper this time, haven't you? Said Mrs. Bucket. Grandma, Charlie said, moving forward to the bed. Listen, Grandma, don't worry about exactly how old you might be. Try to think of a happening instead. Think of something that happened to you, anything you like, as far back as you can. It may help us. Lots of things happened to me, Charlie. So many things happened to me. But can you remember any of them, Grandma? Oh, I don't know, my darling. I suppose I could remember one or two if I thought hard enough. Good, Grandma, good, said Charlie eagerly. Now, what is the very earliest thing you can remember in your whole life? Oh, my dear boy, that really would be going back a few years, wouldn't it? When you were little, Grandma, like me, can't you remember anything you did when you were little? The tiny sunken black eye glimmered faintly, and a sort of smile touched the corners of the almost invisible little slit of the mouth. There was a ship, she said. I can remember a ship. I could never forget that ship. Go on, Grandma, a ship? What sort of ship? Did it sail in her? Of course I sailed in her, my darling. We all sailed in her. Where from? Where to? Charlie went on eagerly. Oh, no, I couldn't tell you that. I was just a tiny little girl. She lay back on the pillow and closed her eyes. Charlie watched her waiting for something more. Everybody waited. No one moved. It had a lovely name, that ship. There was something beautiful, so beautiful about that name. But of course I couldn't possibly remember it. Charlie, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, suddenly jumped up. His face was shining with excitement. If I said the name, Grandma, would you remember it then? I might, Charlie. Yes, I think I might. The Mayflower, cried Charlie. The old woman's head jerked up off the pillow. That's it, she croaked. You've got it, Charlie. The Mayflower. Such a lovely name. Grandpa, Charlie cried out, dancing with excitement. What year did the Mayflower sail? The Mayflower sailed out of Plymouth Harbor on September 6, 1620, said Grandpa Joe. Plymouth, croaked the old woman. That rings a bell, too. Yes, it might easily have been Plymouth. 1620. Sorry. 1620, cried Charlie. Oh, my heavens above. You mean you do it, Grandpa. Well, now, said Grandpa Joe, take 1620 away from 1972. That leaves, don't rush me now, Charlie. That leaves 352. Jumping jackrabbit, yelled Mr. Bucket. She's 352 years old. She's more, said Charlie. How old did you say you were, Grandma, when you sailed on the Mayflower? You were about 8. I think I was even younger than that, my darling. I was only a little bitty girl, probably no more than 6. Then she's 358, gasped Charlie. That's Vita Wong for you, said Mr. Wonka proudly. I told you it was a powerful stuff. 358, said Mr. Bucket. It's unbelievable. Just imagine the things she must have seen in her lifetime, said Grandpa Joe. My poor old mother, wailed Mrs. Bucket. What on earth? Patience, my dear, said Mr. Wonka. Now comes the interesting part. Bring on the Wonkavite. An Oompa Loompa ran forward with a large bottle and gave it to Mr. Wonka. He put it on the bed. Now, how young does she want to be? How young does she want to be? He asked. 78, said Mr. Bucket firmly, exactly where she was before all this nonsense started. Surely she'd like to be a bit younger than that, said Mr. Wonka. Certainly not, said Mrs. Bucket. It's too risky. Too risky, too risky. Too risky, croaked Grandma Georgina. You'll only mice me again if you try to be clever. Have it your way, said Mr. Wonka. Now, then, I've got to do a few sums. Another Oompa Loompa trotted forward holding a blackboard. Mr. Wonka took a piece of chalk and from that he wrote. 14 pills of Wonkavite exactly, said Mr. Wonka. The Oompa Loompa took the blackboard away. Mr. Wonka picked up the bottle from the bed and opened it and counted out 14 of the little brilliant yellow pills. Water, he said. Another Oompa Loompa ran forward with a glass of water. Mr. Wonka tipped all 14 pills into the glass. The water bubbled and frothed. Drink it while it's fizzing, he said, holding the glass up to Grandma Georgina's lips, all in one gulp. She drank it. Mr. Wonka sprang back and took a large brass clock from his pocket. Don't forget, he cried, it's a year a second. She's got 280 years to lose. That'll take her 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Watch the centuries fall away. The room was so silent they could hear the ticking of Mr. Wonka's clock. At first, nothing much happened to the ancient person lying on the bed. She closed her eyes and laid back. Now and again, the puckered skin of her face gave a twitch and her little hands jerked up and down, but that was all. 1 minute gone, called Mr. Wonka. She's 60 years younger. She looks just the same to me, said Mr. Bucket. Of course she does, said Mr. Wonka. What's a mere 60 years when you're over 300 to start with? Are you all right, Mother? Said Mrs. Bucket. Anxiously, talk to me, Mother. 2 minutes gone, called Mr. Wonka. She's 120 years younger. And now definite changes were beginning to show in the old woman's face. The skin was quivering all over, and some of the deepest wrinkles were becoming less and less deep. The mouth less sunken, the nose more prominent. Mother, cried Mrs. Bucket, are you all right? Speak to me, Mother, please. Suddenly, with a suddenness that made everyone jump, the old woman sat, bolted right up in bed and shouted, We've beaten them! Yorktown surrendered! We've kicked them out! Those dirty British! She's going crazy, said Mr. Bucket. Not at all, said Miss Wonka. She's going through 18th century. 3 minutes gone, said Mr. Wonka. Every second now she was growing slightly less and less shriveled, becoming more and more lively. It was a marvelous thing to watch. Gettysburg, she cried. General Lee is on the run. And a few seconds later she let out a great wail of anguish and said, He's dead! He's dead! He's dead! Who's dead? Said Mr. Bucket, craning forward. Lincoln, she wailed. There goes the train. She must have seen it, said Charlie. She must have been there. She is there, said Mr. Wonka. At least she was a few seconds ago. Will someone please explain to me, said Mrs. Bucket, what on earth? 4 minutes gone, said Mr. Wonka. Only 40 seconds left. Only 40 more years to lose. Grandma, cried Charlie, running forward. You're looking almost exactly like you used to. Oh, I'm so glad. Just as long as it all stops when it's meant to, said Mrs. Bucket. I'll bet it doesn't, said Mr. Bucket. Something always goes wrong. Not when I'm in charge of it, sir, said Mr. Wonka. Time's up. She is now 78 years old. How do you feel, dear lady? Is everything all right? I feel tolerable, she said. Just tolerable? But that's no thanks to you, you meddling old mackerel. There she was again, the same cantankerous, crumbling old Grandma Georgina that Charlie had known so well before it started. Mrs. Bucket flung her arms around her and began weeping with joy. The old woman pushed her aside and said, What, may I ask, are those two silly babies doing at the other end of the bed? One of them's your husband, said Mr. Bucket. Rubbish, she said. Where's George? I'm afraid it's true, Mother, said Mrs. Bucket. That's him on the left. The other one's Josephine. You chiseling old cheeseburger, she shouted, pointing a fierce finger at Mr. Wonka. What in the name of... Now, said Mr. Wonka. Let us not, for mercy's sake, have another row so late in the day. If everyone will keep their hair on and leave this to Charlie and me, we shall have them exactly where they used to be, in the flick of a fly's wing. Chapter 19, The Babies Grow Up. Bring on the Vita-Wonk, said Mr. Wonka. We'll soon fix these two babies. And Oompa Loompa ran forward with a small bottle and a couple of silver teaspoons. Wait just a minute, snapped Grandma Georgina. What sort of devilish dumpery are you up to now? It's all right, Grandma, said Charlie. I promise you it's all right. Vita-Wonk does the opposite to Wonkavite. It makes you older. It's what we gave you when you were minus. It saved you. You gave me too much, snapped the old woman. We had to, Grandma. And now you want to do the same to Grandpa George. Of course we don't, said Charlie. I wound up 358 years old, she won. What's to stop you making another little mistake and giving him 50 times more than you gave me? Then I'd suddenly have a 20,000-year-old caveman in bed beside me. Imagine that. And him with a big knobby club in one hand and dragging me around by the hair with the other. No, thank you. It's like Captain Caveman. Grandma, Charlie said patiently. With you we had to use a spray because you were a minus. You were a ghost. But here, Mr. Wonka can. Don't talk to me about that man, she cried. He's batty as a bullfrog. No, Grandma, he is not. And here he can measure it out exactly right, drop by drop, and feed it into their mouths. That's true, isn't it, Mr. Wonka? Charlie, said Mr. Wonka, I can see that the factory is going to be in good hands when I retire. You learn very fast. I am so pleased I chose you, my dear boy. So very pleased. Now then, what's the verdict? Do we leave them as babies or do we grow them up with Vita-Wonk? You go ahead, Mr. Wonka, said Grandpa Joe.
Wonkavite.
I like you to grow my Josie up so she was just the same before, 80 years old. Thank you, sir, said Mr. Wonka. I appreciate the confidence you place in me. But what about the other one, Grandpa George? Oh, all right then, said Grandma Georgina. But if he ends up a caveman, I don't want him in this bed anymore. That's settled then, said Mr. Wonka. Come along, Charlie. We'll do them both together. You hold one spoon and I'll hold the other. I shall measure out 4 drops, and 4 drops only into each spoon, and we'll wake them up and pop it into their mouths. Which one shall I do, Mr. Wonka? You do Grandma Josephina, the tiny one. I'll do Grandpa George, the 1-year-old. Here's your spoon. Charlie took the spoon and held it out. Mr. Wonka opened the bottle and dripped 4 drops of oily black liquid into Charlie's spoon. Then he did the same to his own. He handed the bottle back to the Oompa Loompa. Shouldn't someone hold the babies while you give him it, said Grandpa Joe. I'll hold Grandma Josephine. Are you mad, Mr. Wonka? Don't you realize that Vita-Wonk acts instantly? It's not 1 year or a second like Wonkavite. Vita-Wonk is as quick as lightning. The moment the medicine is swallowed, ping, it all happens. The getting bigger and the growing older and everything else happens in 1 second. So don't you see, my dear, he said to Grandpa Joe, that one moment you'd be holding a tiny baby in the arms, and just 1 second later you'd find yourself staggering about with an 80-year-old woman, and you drop her like a ton of bricks on the floor. I see what you mean, Grandpa Joe said. All set, Charlie? All set, Mr. Wonka. Move around the bed to where the tiny sleeping baby lay. He placed one hand behind her head and lifted it. The baby awoke and started yelling. Mr. Wonka was on the other side. Sorry, let me start over. The baby awoke and started yelling. Mr. Wonka was on the other side of the bed doing the same to the 1-year-old George. Both together now, Charlie, said Mr. Wonka. Ready, set, go. Pop it in. Charlie pushed his spoon into the open mouth of the baby and tipped the drops down their throat. Make sure you swallow it, cried Mr. Wonka. It won't work until it gets in their tummies. It is difficult to explain what happens next, and whatever it was, it only lasted for 1 second. A second is about as long as it takes you to say aloud and quickly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is about how long it took, with Charlie watching closely for the tiny baby to grow and swell and wrinkle into the 80-year-old grandma, Josephine. It was a frightening thing to see. It was like an old explosion. A small baby suddenly exploded into an old woman, and Charlie all at once found himself staring straight into the well-known and much-loved, wrinkly old face of the Grandma Josephine. "Hello, my darling," she said. "Where have you come from?" "Josie!" cried Grandpa Joe, rushing forward. "How marvelous you're back!" "I didn't know I'd been away," he said. Grandpa George had also made a successful comeback. "You were better looking as a baby," Grandma Georgina said to him. "But I'm glad you're growing up again, George, for one reason." "What's that?" asked Grandpa George. "You won't wet the bed anymore." Chapter 20, last chapter. How to get someone out of bed. "I am sure," said Mr. Wonka, addressing Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, Grandma Josephine, "I am quite sure the three of you, after all that, will now want to jump out of bed and lend a hand running the chocolate factory." "Who was?" said Grandma Josephine. "Yes, you," said Mr. Wonka. "Are you crazy?" said Grandma Georgina. "I'm staying right here where I'm in this nice, comfortable bed. Thank you very much." "Me too," said Grandpa George. At that moment, there was a sudden commotion among the Oompa Loompas at the far end of the chocolate room. There was a buzz of excitement, chatter, and a lot of running about and waving the arms, and all of this. A single Oompa Loompa emerged and came rushing toward them, toward Mr. Wonka, carrying a huge envelope in his hand. He came up close to Mr. Wonka. He started whispering Mr. Wonka bent down to listen. Remember, the Oompa Loompas always come up and talk into his ear. "Outside the factory gates, cried Mr. Wonka. "Men. What sort of men?" "Yes, but do they look dangerous? Are they acting dangerous?" "And a what?" "A helicopter, and these men came out of it. They gave you this." Mr. Wonka grabbed the huge envelope and quickly slid it open and pulled out the folded letter inside. There was absolute silence as he skimmed swiftly over what was written on the paper. Nobody moved. Charlie began to feel cold. He knew something dreadful was going to happen. There was a very definite smell of danger in the air. The men outside the gates, the helicopter, the nervousness of the Oompa Loompas. He was watching Mr. Wonka's face, searching for a clue, for some changes in expression that would tell him how bad the news was. "Great whistling whangdoodles!" cried Mr. Wonka, leaping so high in the air that when he landed his legs gave way and crushed onto his backside. "Snorting snozzlewhackers!" he yelled, picking himself up and waving the letter about as though it were swatting mosquitoes. "Listen to this, all of you! Just listen to this!" He began to read aloud. "The White House, Washington, D.C." This is the letter. "To Mr. Willy Wonka. Sir, today the entire nation, indeed the whole world, is rejoicing at the safe return of our commuter capsule from the space with 136 souls on board. Had it not been for the help they received from an unknown spaceship, these 136 people would never have come back. It has been reported to me that the courage shown by the 8 astronauts aboard the unknown spaceship was extraordinary. Our radar stations, by tracking the spaceship on its return to Earth, have discovered that it splashed down in a place known as Wonka's Chocolate Factory. That, sir, is why this letter is being delivered to you. I wish now to show the gratitude of the nation by inviting all 8 of those incredibly brave astronauts to come and stay in the White House for a few days as my honored guest. I am arranging a special celebration party in the Blue Room this evening at which I myself will pin medals for bravery upon all 8 of these gallant flyers. The most important person in the land will be present at this gathering to salute the heroes whose dazzled deeds will be written forever in the history of our nation. Among those attending will be the Vice President, Miss Elizabeth Tibbs, all the members of the Cabinet, the Chief of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all members of Congress, a famous sword swallower from Afghanistan who is now teaching me to eat my words. What you do is you take this S off the beginning of the word and you put it in the other end before swallowing it. And who else is coming? Oh yes, my chief interpreter and the governor of every state in the union. And of course my cat, Mrs. Tabapus. A helicopter awaits all 8 of you outside the factory gates. I myself await your arrival at the White House with the very greatest pleasure and impatience. I beg to remain, sir. Most sincerely yours, Lancelot R. Gilligrass. Lancelot R. Gilligrass, President of the United States. P.S. Could you please bring me a few Wonka Fudge Mellow Delights? I love them so much, but everybody around here keeps stealing mine out of the drawer in my desk, and I don't tell Nanny. Mr. Wonka stopped reading, and in the silliness that followed, Charlie could hear people breathing. He could hear them breathing in and out much faster than usual. And there were other things too. There were so many feelings and passions, and there was so much sudden happiness and swirling around in the air. It made his head spin. Grandpa Joe was the first to say something. Yippee! He yelled out, and he flew across the room and caught Charlie by the hands, and the two of them started dancing along the back of the chocolate factory. A chocolate river. We're going, Charlie, sang Grandpa. We're going to the White House after all. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket were also dancing, laughing, and singing. Mr. Wonka ran all over the room, proudly showing the president's letter to the Oompa Loompas. After a minute or so, Mr. Wonka clapped his hands for attention. Come along, he called out. We mustn't dilly. We mustn't dally. Come on, Charlie. And you, Sir Grandpa Joe, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket. The helicopter is outside the gates. We can't keep it waiting. He began hustling the four of them toward the door. Hey! Screamed Grandma Georgina from the bed. What about us? We were invited too. Don't you forget that. It said all 8 of us were invited, Grandma Josephine. And that includes me, said Grandpa George. Mr. Wonka turned to look at them. Of course it includes you, he said. But we can't possibly get the bed into the helicopter and go through the door. You mean if we don't get out of bed, we can't come? Said Grandma Georgina. That's exactly what I made, said Mr. Wonka. Keep going, Charlie, he whispered, giving Charlie a little nudge. Keep walking toward the door. Suddenly behind them, there was a great swoosh of blankets and sheets and pingings and bed springs as the 3 old people all exploded out of the bed together. They came sprinting after Mr. Wonka. Wait for us! Wait for us! It was amazing how fast they were running across the floor of the great chocolate room. Mr. Wonka and Charlie and the others stood staring at them in wonder. They leaped across the path and over the bushes like gazelles in springtime, with their bare legs flashing and their night shirts flying out from the bed. Suddenly, Grandma Josephine put the brakes on, so... See, they're flying out of bed. Hard, she skid 5 yards before coming to a stop. Wait, she screamed. We must be mad. We can't go to the famous party in the White House in our nightshirts. We can't stand there practically naked in front of all those people while the president pins medals on all of us. Oh, wailed Grandma Georgina. Oh, what are we going to do? Don't you have any clothes with you at all? Asked Mr. Wonka. Of course we don't, said Grandma Georgina. We haven't been out of that bed for 20 years. We can't go, wailed Grandma Georgina. We'll have to stay behind. Couldn't we buy something from a store, said Grandpa George. With what, said Grandma Josephina. We don't have any money. Money, cried Mr. Wonka. Good gracious me. Don't you go worrying about money. I've got plenty of that. Listen, said Charlie. Why couldn't we ask the helicopter to land on the roof of a big department store on the way over? Then you can all pop downstairs and buy exactly what you want. Charlie cried, Mr. Wonka grasping him by the hand. What will we do without you? You're brilliant. Come along, everybody. We're off to stay in the White House. They all linked arms and went dancing out the chocolate room and along the corridors and out through the front door into the open where the big helicopter was awaiting near the factory gates. A group of extremely important-looking gentlemen came forward them and bowed. Well, Charlie, said Grandpa Joe, it certainly has been a busy day. It's not over yet, Charlie said, laughing. It hasn't even begun. The end.
That was the end of the story, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and
Roald Dahl, Ronald, Roald Dahl. He was the author of this book. Born 1916, died 1990. Gene Wilder died, and he created the movie Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. He did an outstanding job playing Willy Wonka. Johnny Depp played it too. But this is part 2 of Charlie, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Thank you, everybody, for listening to our book.
We'll decide,
Our next book, Gracie's going to get to pick out the next book. And remember, do not take any medicine out of your parents' or grandparents' cabinets. Remember to read every day. And remember, all you kids out there, you're important, you matter, and you make a difference. And you are loved, not by just your parents, but by the entire world. Grow up kind. Grow up proud. And know you are the greatest gift there is. And Gracie, thank you for letting me read this book to you. I appreciate it. I love you very, very much. Mwah. For everybody else out there, we'll talk to you guys soon. It's time for us to go play now outside.
Yay!